and start to screen share whilst I introduce you. Ian will be familiar to many MHS members because having received his PhD from the Manchester Metropolitan University, whilst he was studying for his PhD, he became the winner of the inaugural MHS Essay Prize, and indeed won it again in 2023. So has the distinction of being the only person to have won the essay prize twice. And indeed, we've in response to that, we have indeed made it harder for somebody to win twice. This wouldn't have affected Ian, but after Ian's second success, we realised that we needed to just sort of stop people becoming serial entrants, and so introduced a new rule that a winner could not resubmit for a further 3 years. But Ian has that honour. He is published widely on the posthumous cult of St Thomas de Canthilloute, Bishop of Hereford, in the latter part of the 13th century. And he's currently preparing a text and translation of the Miracles of St Thomas of Hereford, as well as editing his doctoral thesis for publication. And this afternoon, for our final talk of the afternoon, Ian is going to be talking about the subject of his prize-winning essay, an ecclesiastical Mortimer, the career of Edmund Mortimer in the Church. Just for a little bit of context, Edmund is one of those Mortimers that gets sandwiched between two Rogers. Probably the two most well-known Roger Mortimers. The Roger who I am studying, the Roger Mortimer of the mid-13th century, who was the father of Edmund Mortimer, and then Edmund's own son, Roger Mortimer, who was actively involved in the forced abdication of Edward I, along with Queen Isabella, and became the virtual ruler of the country before being raised to the rank of Earl of March. And so between those two characters, Roger's son and the father of the second Roger, Edmund, tends to get lost a bit. So we're really grateful to Ian for the work that he is doing to rescue Edmund Mortimer from that position and bring him more into the light. So over to you, Ian.
Thanks, Philip, for that introduction. I should probably add as well that Edmund isn't just sandwiched between two Rogers, he's sandwiched between three, because you have the father, Roger, who dies in 1282, you have the son from 1330, but you also have his brother, Roger Mortimer, who becomes Roger Mortimer of Chirk, who is
Indeed.
far more well known in those situations as well, because of his military career and military successes. So in 1265, a dispute erupted between Edmund Mortimer and Ormery de Montfort. Ormery was the son of Simon de Montfort, the 6th Earl of Leicester. Now, this was not a case concerning secular matters between lords over land or anything like that, but rather it was over ecclesiastical preferment between two sons who had forged careers in the church. At its heart, the disagreement centred on the contentious appointment of both men at different times that year in 1265 to the treasury of York Minster. The dignity of the treasurership at York Minster was one of the wealthiest ecclesiastical livings underneath the bishops in England, and it was valued in 1291 at £233, 6 shillings and 8 pence. And it was fought over by both papal curia and the royal crown as one of the lucrative prizes for their own chosen candidates overall. As Barry Dobson, I think, has previously put it, no position in the Church of York was more eagerly sought after, and none was a source of greater litigation. Edmund and Ormery's quarrel continued on into the 1280s, when Edmund apparently renounced his holy orders so that he could become Lord of Wigmore. And it only truly concluded, really, with Ormry's death at the turn of the 14th century. Yet, despite the fact that this dispute alone between Edmund and Ormry lasted almost as long as Edmund's 22-year tenure as Lord of Wigmore, modern accounts have never really sort of paid any attention to Edmund's time in the church. The most modern treatments that we've had up till now about Edmund's clerical career have been in the Fasti Ecclesiae Anglicanae and in A.B. Emden's biographical register of the University of Oxford. As Philip mentioned, in a way, Edmund is sort of not alone in this treatment because despite the fact that many members of the medieval Mortimer family did embark on careers in the church, people haven't really studied them. But this is the case is probably indicative of a couple of things. Mostly the prominent part played by the secular male members of the family within the socio-political sphere of the day. In particular, Edmund's father, for instance, on the political scene of England in the 13th century. And then, of course, Edmund's infamous son Roger, the first Earl of March, who was de facto ruler of England between 1327 and 1330 as the paramour of Queen Isabella. Second, and perhaps strangely for us, no one with the surname of Mortimer, so no one from the main Wigmore branch or any of the cadet branches in the Middle Ages, actually rose above the post of Archbishop's steward or bishop's official. And it wasn't until the 20th century that we ended up with Robert Cecil Mortimer, who was consecrated as Bishop of Exeter in 1949. And then the other thing that compounds this is the fact that the source base for these ecclesiastical Mortimers is rather lacking. And so it makes writing the biographies of these people quite difficult, because all we generally find is a snippet of information about them, whether it's just a name in a extant actum or something like that, and it becomes really difficult to pin together that chronology of where they were and what they are doing. So the purpose of the paper that I'm giving today then is to try and provide an account of Edmund and his career in the church before he ended up becoming Lord of Wigmore in the November of 1282. So over the next little while, we'll explore Edmund's early education, his appointments as Treasurer of York, as a prebend of Hereford, and as a rector of Chipping Campden in Gloucestershire before becoming Lord of Wigmore. And it's hoped that the longer Mortimer History Society journal entry, as well as this talk, will help lay the foundations for future studies of Edmund, particularly looking at his secular career then in light of his learned abilities. And so hopefully we can have a far more nuanced examination of a man who, as we've already said, is often overshadowed by his father, Roger, his brother, Roger, and his son, Roger. So, Edmund Mortimer was the second son of Roger Mortimer and Maud de Briouse, and was born around about 1251. He was a member of the mainline branch of the family and was descended from a Marcher dynasty that was marking itself as preeminent in that region, and where they had secured a significant landholding based on the familial seat of Wigmore. From a young age, however, Edmund was not destined to follow his father as Lord of Wigmore. That duty instead lay with his elder brother, Ralph. So Edmund's early life then was to be forged in the church. It's impossible to trace the earliest of Edmund's education or anything like that, or his inception into clerical orders, but it seems plausible to suggest that he probably had some of his clerical learning at Wigmore Abbey, at the family's monastic foundation. And as Nicholas Orme has shown, abbeys like this, that are patronised by major families at the time, would normally take in the sons of noble lords intended for the church. And this was almost in a way to acclimatize them to that state of living, because the living that the abbots would have were not too dissimilar to the environment of the lay aristocracy at the time. It may be possible as well that Edmund, after having this early education, if he did have it at Wigmore, may have moved on to the newly established school at Ludlow, just 8 miles away from Wigmore, or have gone to the more established and famous schools of Hereford Cathedral at the time, again, just 12 miles distant from Wigmore. What we can find is that some point in the late 1260s, around about 1268, Edmund seems to have embarked on a course of study at Oxford University, which is suggested in particular by this entry from the Register Archbishop Walter Giffard of York, in which the Archbishop instructs his household clerk, Hugh Everard, to render £20 to the Archbishop's constable at Oxford for the expenses of Edmund Mortimer, so indicating that Edmund has got a lot of expenses in Oxford at this time. Edmund's whereabouts in the 1270s, again, he's difficult to pin down, but it's clear that he maintained royal favour by evidence of gifts of deer from the King's Parks in Woodstock, and Woodstock was one of the parks that's near Oxford, and he received that in November 1270 and in February of 1272. On the 26th of April 1272, Edmund in particular is named as being released from a summons from the justices of the Forest in Yorkshire, and similarly his father and his brothers Ralph and Roger are also granted a similar release in Herefordshire. And importantly, on this latter entry, it records the presence of a Master Philip de Craft, who is listed specifically as the guardian and master of Edmund. So taken all together, really, these entries that we have suggest that Edmund might have been spending his time between Oxford, where he's been getting the gifts of the King's deer and money from the Archbishop of York, York in particular, where he was treasurer, hence the release from the justices, the summons by the justices of the Forest of Yorkshire, and in Hereford, where of course his master and guardian was. Further evidence in the close rolls of the King's Chancery also implies that Edmund was back studying in Oxford by the mid-1270s, where a writ dated to the 5th of October 1276 notified the Sheriff of Oxford that the King had committed his houses to Edmund, and that Edmund was permitted to have them during the King's pleasure. Unfortunately, nothing else is really known about Edmund's potential studies at Oxford or education. It's tempting to suggest that Edmund probably graduated with at least a medieval bachelor's degree, and he might well have pursued a master's, although no records actually refer to him as magister. He's always referred to as lord or dominus, domini, or domino. But as Jeremy Catto has previously shown in his studies of the medieval university system, the degree of Master of Arts required 6 years of study and then a further 2 years of lecturing in the faculty. So while it is just conjecture, it seems to be that Edmund coming out as magister, perhaps Edmund Mortimer, may be the best suggestion for the near decade that we can infer that he has spent studying in Oxford. But Edmund's path, of course, as mentioned, seems to have been set rather early on. It was not long in his life before his father's influence at the royal court was felt, and a guiding hand was actually offered by King Henry III. So on the 13th of November 1263, the king, while he was at Winchester, made a promise to the 13-year-old Edmund that he would provide a competent benefice as soon as an opportunity occurred. The grant was issued, of course, at a crucial time, because in the October the king had finally come to an agreement with Roger Mortimer over the manor of Lechlade in Gloucestershire, which therefore then secured the loyalty of someone who would go on to be the king's most faithful ally. Unfortunately for Edmund, though, this promise would not materialise for almost 2 years because England was gripped by civil war. Following the capture of the King Henry and the Lord Edward by the barons, led by Simon de Montfort at the Battle of Lewes on the 14th of May 1264, the king's ability to exercise royal ecclesiastical patronage was curtailed. Decisions on whom to collate to benefices was now decided by the baronial council, who were ruling England in all but name. And it was in this period of baronial control that on the 7th of February 1265, the king was forced and made to appoint his nephew, Simon de Montfort's third son, Ormery, to the treasurership of York. Just over a year later, on the 4th of August 1265, the Montfortian regime was then shattered at the Battle of Evesham, and the king was quick to restore some semblance of royal authority and patronage. During this time, there was a flurry of activity in which the king made a number of lavish gifts to those who were loyal to him. Among them, foremost, was Roger Mortimer, who had been instrumental in the escape of the Lord Edward from Hereford. Roger received battle spoils, the most famous of which that we historians keep talking about whenever we bring up the spoils that he received was Simon's severed head, along with the Earl's testicles, which he then sent to his wife Maud Mortimer in Wigmore. But Roger also extended his territory, and Maud herself ended up being given the land of 11 rebels from the Wigmore area. Importantly, the king also did not forget his promise to Edmund. Just 3 days after the battle, on the 7th of August 1265, while he was nursing a wound at Worcester, King Henry issued a mandate to the chapter of York Minster, rescinding Ormery de Montfort's presentation to the treasurership. The reason given in the calendar of the patent rolls was that Ormery had received the office not through the king's appointment himself, but rather through Earl Simon's control of the king's seal. The king, of his own free will, now specifically bestowed the treasurership upon Edmund Mortimer and commanded the chapter to assign him a stall in the choir and a place in chapter. By this time, Ormery had already fled England with his remaining family, taking refuge in France. So Evesham really was a major reversal of fortunes, particularly for these two sons of those who had fought in the battle. In September of 1265, the king's revocation of the institutions to benefices that the Montfortian regime had made were further legitimised when Pope Clement IV issued a papal bull cancelling all pacts made by the king and prince to de Montfort and his adherents. This in particular might have been important for Edmund, especially since the York chapter appeared hesitant, maybe, in accepting the royal appointment now of the now 15-year-old cleric. This point is made ever so clear with King Henry's repetition of the 7th of August mandate on the 17th of September 1265, noting specifically that he commanded the chapter to assign him a stall in the choir and a place in the chapter, which to his amazement they have put off doing. So he was not too pleased with the chapter's procrastination. Yet Edmund's position remained in a state of flux well into 1266, as revealed by a letter from the king to the chapter. The letter opens with the lines that, "We remind you of our letters and instructions given to you repeatedly, that you shall admit Edmund Mortimer, to whom we have entrusted the treasury of your church, to the same, assigning a stall in a choir and a place in the chapter. And you shall make a complete response to him for all arrears from the time of Ormery de Montfort." The letter, which is quite lengthy, goes on to note the sorry state of the Minster's finances. It highlights the high level of debt that the minster at the time was actually in, and it ordered the arrears of rent to be paid to the king's man, Nicholas de Woodford, so that any debts might be rectified. If Edmund had already been taken up appointment and had received the monies expected in his role as treasurer, he was then to inform Nicholas himself. The king ended the letter by stating, "We have arranged this for the affection that we hold towards the church and its prelate. Therefore conduct yourselves in this matter in such a way that you seem to love the welfare of your church, so that we do not have to issue a first order again or any other arrangement regarding this matter." These words are excoriating, really, in their tone, and provide a damning royal indictment of the York chapter's mounting debts and seemingly continued indecision on Edmund's appointment. The king's position and that of Edmund was further bolstered by the issue of a papal bull on the 6th of July 1266. The Pope went into detail explaining the king's plight, that he'd appointed Ormery to the treasurership while under duress, and while he was being held captive by the Montfortian regime. And then the Pope's following command couldn't have been clearer. "By these apostolic writings we command that you in your discretion not to consider in any way the said Ormery as treasurer of the said church, and you shall by no means treat him in any manner as treasurer of the said church, given that, mentioned above, the king did not have free authority to make the grant concerning his own rights and those of his kingdom." It seems likely then that the York chapter, following this papal edict, bowed to the confirmation, despite Ormery's probable continuing protestations from France. And in 1267, it seems that finally Edmund had taken up his post in York and received the dignities of treasurer. He's introduced in this capacity in a letter of William Wigmore, who was then the Chancellor of York and future Archbishop, which confirmed that the chapter had entrusted the guardianship of benefices, lands and revenues of the treasury of our Church of York to Lord Edmund Mortimer. It seems that Edmund had started prosecuting his duties diligently, with the Chancellor noting that he follows our counsel and assent, making suitable provision from the income of his guardianship for the ministers and others belonging to the church. However, despite being in possession of the treasury and able to take up residence at York as needed, this was not the end of the matter. During this time, Ormery was clearly making his appeals known, either in person or through proctors at the papal curia. Despite the earlier papal bulls in September of 1265 and July of 1266 depriving him of the treasurership, the Pope somehow, for whatever reason, had an apparent change of heart, and on the 19th of March 1267 granted Ormery an exemption from these previous orders. Why such a large change in policy happened is unclear, but certainly it caused issues for Edmund, who had especially if he's only recently been acknowledged and installed in the York chapter. The matter, of course, dragged on into 1268, and it seems at this point that Roger Mortimer, Edmund's father, threw his political weight behind his son's claim. On 27th of May 1268, Archbishop Walter Giffard's clerk, while in London, recorded in the register the appointment of a Roger de Pule and a Peter de Orvieto as attorneys who were there to represent Roger and Edmund in the suit against Ormery. The letters were transferred to Master Adam de Fileby to be transmitted on to the papal curia. It becomes increasingly difficult to trace events after this point. Certainly, as far as the English crown was concerned, Edmund remained Treasurer of York, since Ormery was in exile on the continent and therefore not recognised to hold the position in any capacity. This in particular, again, is shown in one of those grants of deer from the King's Park at Woodstock, where he specifically refers to Edmund as Edmund Mortimer, son of Roger Mortimer, Treasurer of York. In October 1274, Ormery then brought a further suit against Edmund, and this time it was to be heard before the official of Paris, seemingly having no luck at getting the suit heard in England. Ormery is recorded as having appointed a Master Nicholas de Marlborough and Nicholas de Waltham as his attorneys in this matter. And Charles Beaumont, in his 19th century biography of Simon de Montfort, noted that a papal bull was issued, though undated, at the time, and it was from Ormery's request specifically, which confirmed an excommunication that Ormery himself placed on Edmund in his capacity as a papal chaplain. And this bull apparently threatened that the papal legates would then uphold this sentence of excommunication if Edmund didn't leave England to attend the adjudication of the official of Paris. What Edmund's reaction to these summons is not recorded. When Ormery then returned to England in late 1275 or 1276, while accompanying his sister Eleanor to Wales for her marriage to Llewellyn ap Griffith, Ormery was captured by mercenaries employed by King Edward I and was then subsequently imprisoned in the king's castles, only to be released in April 1282. It would appear then that during this time, between 1275-76 through to 1282, Edmund could prosecute his duties as Treasurer of York without Ormery's continued interruptions during the period. Edmund seems to have been in attendance at the King's Court at Ruthlin in Denbighshire in August of 1282. This is really we get this massive period where we don't know what Edmund is up to between 1275-76 and 1282. On the 6th of August, 1282, the king issued a commission of oyer and terminer to 2 royal justices in York, following a complaint by Edmund. The case specifically was against 12 men from the parish of Clifton near York, who on one night had released a number of cattle which had been impounded there on Edmund's orders. In the ensuing scuffle, 3 of Edmund's officials were wounded and maltreated by these 12 men of Clifton. 2 days later, on the 8th of August, the king granted Edmund letters of protection, which were to last until Christmas that year. These letters are important because it appears that the king had need of Edmund's administrative abilities that would take him away from his benefices at the time. The patent rolls reveal that on the same day, the king appointed Edmund as the custodian of the castle and hundred of Oswestry in Shropshire, as well as the castle and honour of Arundel in Sussex, during the minority of his nephew, Richard FitzAlan. The chief duty noted in these entries was that Edmund was to render a total of 350 marks, or conveniently £233 6 shillings and 8 pence yearly from these estates to the Abbot of Vale Royal in Cheshire. It seems highly doubtful in this circumstance, unlike some modern historians have claimed, that Edmund was actually to undertake any military duties whatsoever in this capacity. The way that the Chancery Roll structures it makes it seem as if Edmund is appointed more to look after his nephew's interests in the capacity as a learned administrator, using his knowledge and skills from his duties as Treasurer of York, rather than to undertake any military action in the present war against Wales that was going on at the time. It's presumed that some point in the November or December of 1282, once Edmund had received livery of his lands and inherited the lordship of Wigmore, that he may have resigned the treasurership. But the case over the treasury seemed to follow Edmund into his early career as lord, and it doesn't seem as clear-cut as Edmund having an early resignation. A letter specifically dated to the 31st of March 1283 from the Archbishop of Canterbury, John Peckham, comes in response to correspondence that he received about 10 days earlier on the 21st of March from the Bishop of Arras in France. The Archbishop's letter described specifically how he had received a mandate that claimed to be from the Bishop of Arras, and it was said that the Bishop of Arras had been appointed as one of a number of judges delegate by the papacy to adjudicate the suit between Ormry and Edmund. The bishop's letter was quoted in full, noting the command that the archbishop was to order through himself or another Lord Edmund Mortimer, a cleric of the Diocese of Hereford, born of the nobleman the late Roger Mortimer, to appear before us either in person or through suitable proxies with all his acts, rights and documents on the Friday the 17th of April 1282. Before the Venerable Lord Ormry de Montfort, chaplain of the Lord Pope. The bishop's letter also claimed that the case had previously been brought before the Dean of Lincoln and the Archdeacon of Northumberland in Durham Cathedral, although the decision reached by that panel is not recorded in the letter, annoyingly. The Bishop of Arras's letter ends with the dating clause, placing it on the 15th of February 1282. Despite the apparent seriousness of this letter, Archbishop John's response was measured and questioned its legitimacy. The Archbishop was moved not to execute the mandate until either the papacy or the bishop confirmed its validity. The fact even that there had been a commission in this regard, and that the Archbishop hadn't been informed about it beforehand, proved a point of vexation for him. There was also the suspicion of forgery in this letter. So the Archbishop's letter noted the seals attached, the fact that the wax was different in every regard to what he would have expected, along with the interlineation, so a number of edits had been made to the letter, and the clear erasure of the date, which also placed the letter a year earlier than it arrived. It arrived on the 21st of March 1283, but is dated to the 17th of April 1282. Unfortunately, though, it's been impossible to trace whether or not the Archbishop ever received a reply regarding this document's legitimacy. It seems, however, that Edmund would have known about this development, for on the 19th of June 1283, the king issued a letter prohibiting any legal proceedings against Edmund in any court beyond the realm. And it seems plausible maybe to suggest then, with the king issuing this letter and the idea of Ormry still trying to press this claim, that Edmund may not have been so quick in resigning the benefice. Another mention does come later on in 1285 in the Register of Richard Swinfield, talking about the fact that Swinfield had and continued to support Edmund in the case against Ormry, but he didn't wish any of his own actions to be impeded or viewed disfavourably by the papacy. So it seems to be that he already has in his mind something that's going to go on in 2 years later with the cult of Thomas de Cantelupe being launched. Ormry, on the other hand, seems to have continued to try his luck to gain the office of treasurer. His belief in his own rightful place is evident in the glazing scheme of the late 1280s and 1290s in York Minster's chapter house, where a window bearing the Montfortian arms was probably actually funded by Ormry himself. And in his 1289 will, he specifically styled himself as papal chaplain, treasurer of York, canon of Rouen, Earl of Leicester, and Palatine of Chester. Even with the chaos of the treasurer dispute, Edmund found himself appointed to a canonry and prebendal stall in Hereford Cathedral sometime in the late 1260s or early 1270s. An entry in a compotus roll dated to the 24th of June 1273 listed the disbursement of 30 shillings and 3 pence for the small common fund of Lord Edmund Mortimer. A remaining £29 8 1/4 pence was then to be dispersed amongst the residentiary canons, indicating that at this time Edmund was a non-resident canon. What prebend Edmund was instituted to at this time is not named and seems to be unidentifiable, though I think Julia Barrow in the updated Fasti Ecclesiae Anglicanae has had a good stab at which prebends Edmund might have had. Similarly, Edmund's location for non-residents is not known at this time, but based on what we've already discussed, he could be in York prosecuting his duties as treasurer, or he's in Oxford with his studies. In 1275, Bishop John Le Breton of Hereford died, and his chosen candidate, Thomas de Cantilupe, was elected. The new bishop's election might have been a cause for some concern from Edmund's perspective specifically, because Bishop Thomas had previously been a close adherent of the Montfortian regime, acting as the Chancellor of England, and had also found himself at odds with Roger Mortimer following the despoiling of Hereford and its nearby towns in 1265. Both men would have known each other from their respective positions in the church at York. Edmund as treasurer, Thomas in 1274 to 1275 followed in his brother's footsteps, Hugh, as precentor of York. As well as the fact that Edmund might also have been a student in Oxford during Thomas's second tenure as Chancellor of Oxford between 1273 and 1275. So it may well be suggested on these grounds that there was perhaps a respectful coalition between the two men, regardless of the troubles of the previous decade. On the 11th of July 1276, Edmund was the first in a witness list to Bishop Cantilupe's actum informing the Prior of Leinster of an episcopal visitation that would take place on the 12th of September that year. Now, Edmund had been appointed only a couple of days earlier, on the 8th of July, to a prebend belonging to Master Peter of Radnor, which seems, from what we can trace, to be the prebend of Hunderton. So, in July 1276, then, it seems certain that Edmund at least spends a little bit of time in Hereford, particularly since he is present in Leinster for the issuing of this intention of the bishop to conduct an episcopal visitation on the Priory of Leinster. We might see Edmund's appointment then perhaps as a prebendary of Hereford, as an honorary formality in a way, given the Mortimer family's close associations with the diocese. Unfortunately, no other documents in the Dean and Chapter archives reference Edmund at all. So it indicates that there was a long period of non-residence there. And the only time that he does seem to be present in Hereford for this is in July of 1276. Also, we should note that Hunderton was not a valuable prebend at all. It was valued in 1291 as worth only £5 and 8 shillings annually. So it's quite a comparison really with the York treasurership at £233 going down to 5. But it's probably intended just to supplement Edmund's income at this time, perhaps to support his studies at Oxford. And then on the 7th of December 1282, Edmund has certainly resigned the benefice, and the king grants it to one of his royal clerks. In 1281, though, Edmund had become embroiled in another dispute. This time, it centred on his appointment as the rector of Chippingcampden in Gloucester by the Abbot of Chester, and then the Bishop of Worcester's desire to deprive him of this living in order that his own chaplain, Adam of Avebury, could be collated to the post. While the dispute over the treasury at York was born out of questions relating to the usual operation of royal patronage, the Chipping-Campden episode is far more complex in both its nature and the difficulties encountered in untangling the chronology of events that unfold. On the evidence that we have available, the sequence of events seem to run like this. In around about 1278, Edmund was appointed by the abbot of Chester to the rectory of Chipping-Campden. The abbots had owned the advowson of the rectorship since the 11th century as part of their foundational grants from the Earls of Chester. Some point in late 1280 or early 1281, Bishop Godfrey attempted to deprive Edmund from the rectory and appointed his own chaplain, Adam of Avebury, as rector instead. The bishop's argument to do this was a rather simple one, and it hinged entirely on the 13th canon of the Second Council of Leon in 1274, which states that the person appointed is obliged to reside in the parish church where he has become rector, in order that he may take more diligent care of the flock entrusted to him. Within a year of being appointed to this charge, he is to have himself ordained to the priesthood. If within that time he has not been ordained, he is to be deprived of his church, even without previous warning, by authority of the present constitution. And it's under this constitution that Edmund was deprived. So Bishop Godfrey's letter to Archbishop John Peckham on the 23rd of February 1281 urged the Archbishop to proceed with the case in the Court of Arches to deprive Edmund of the rectory of Chipping-Campden. Primary among this was the fact that it was alleged that Edmund had not taken priest's orders within a year of his appointment, so therefore came under this, and more specifically had not actually done so for 3 years, hence the suggestion that Edmund was actually in post around about 1278. A further appeal was then made on the 25th of February 1281 by Robert of Kidderminster, who was one of Bishop Godfrey's proctors, claiming that Edmund had not even taken the lower orders of an acolyte or subdeacon. Interestingly, the bishop's letters mention that it was by the archbishop's command specifically that Edmund had been deprived and Adam's collation had been approved. The validity of this claim is difficult to ascertain, specifically because Bishop Godfrey's letter is dated 23rd of February, and it's not until the 30th of October that John Peckham records his confirmation. And then similarly, a day after, on the 31st of October, we have an ironic twist in the tale where Edmund is afforded letters of protection by John Peckham against this suit in the Court of Arches. So what actually is going on is really unclear. Whatever the case, though, it seems that Edmund refused to relinquish the church to Adam of Avebury, and this is what prompted Bishop Godfrey in his outpouring. And Bishop Godfrey perhaps must have hoped that at some point soon the Archbishop would move swiftly to decide the matter in his favour. Unfortunately, this wasn't the case, and the Archbishop must have surely felt himself in a difficult position, because on the one hand, he had the Mortimers whom he wouldn't want to offend, given that Roger's star had aligned closely with that of the Lord Edward and had been in the ascendant for the last 10 years of Edward I's reign. And then on the other hand, he didn't want to quarrel with his suffragan bishop, with whom relations had already started to be strained over similar disputes. Despite these letters in February, Adam of Avebury is recorded as depositing £50 with different merchants at the Archbishop's court to help fund his case at the Curia. What Edmund is doing, the record unfortunately is lamentably silent. In August of 1282, though, there seems to be some movement on this, where the papacy appoints the judges delegate to be the abbots of Bristol, the abbot of Wigmore, and the prior of Coventry, who are to decide on the matter. However, a petition in 1282 by Bishop Godfrey states the fact that they had postponed making a decision specifically out of fear of Edmund's father, Roger. Also on the 8th of August, which probably played into this, the 8th of August 1282, the royal letters of protection, while Edmund took up the role of administering the Castle and Hundred of Oswestry and the Castle and Honour of Arundel, came into effect. It was the 1st of November 1282 when a decision was finally reached and a certificate was issued by the Dean of Campden, the Prior of Shrewsbury, and the Precentor of Evesham, who were the sort of the sub-delegates of the abbots of Bristol and Wigmore and the Prior of Coventry. This certificate confirmed that Edmund actually was the rector under the rights of the abbots of Chester, and that the excommunication that Bishop Godfrey Giffard had placed on him was not binding. It was requested then by the papacy's judges that Edmund was to have quiet possession of the church, and Bishop Godfrey was to pay 100 marks to cover all of the costs that had been incurred. It seems that at this point in the November of 1282 that Edmund was likely carrying out the dual duties of entering into the role of Lord of Wigmore, as well as his ecclesiastical duties. And Bishop Godfrey was therefore well aware that Edmund would likely be resigning this benefice and hoped that Adam of Avebury could take it up. Edmund, a fortnight later in Chester, on the 25th of November 1282, resigned as rector. And despite Edmund resigning from the rectory in 1282, again, the dispute followed him into his early days as Lord of Wigmore, when on the 4th of March 1283, because the abbot of Chester had again pressed their historic rights to make the appointment of the rectory of Chipping Campden, the judgment was reviewed and it was reopened. The decision was reversed, and Edmund was now cited by the abbot of Bristol and the prior of Coventry, and specifically this entry mentions that the abbot of Wigmore was unwilling to attend and be present at the issuing of this. And Edmund was ordered to pay £100 then to Bishop Godfrey and Adam of Avebury under the threat of greater excommunication. Whether Edmund paid this or not is unclear and not recorded, but as the new Lord of Wigmore, he would have certainly had the means to pay and end this dispute. So, following the death of Roger Mortimer in October 1282, Edmund had a decision to make. Either he could renounce his newly acquired lands and titles, probably in favour of his brother Roger of Chirk, or he could renounce his holy orders and resign from his ecclesiastical appointments. Edmund chose the latter, and it seems probable that the issuing of these resignations took longer than has previously been anticipated. Edmund certainly resigned Hereford in November or December 1282, when the king appoints Geoffrey of Newbold to the same prebend. 25th of November 1282, Edmund resigns from the rectory of Chipping Campden. It's presumed that Edmund resigns York around about the same time, but his successor in the post, Bogo de Clare, is not appointed by royal collation until the 15th of September 1285. Specifically in King Edward's letter of June 1283 to grant protection against Ormery de Montfort wanting him to be at the Bishop of Arras's cathedral, the king refers to him as Edmund Mortimer, Treasurer of York, a cleric. And its inclusion in the Bishop of Hereford's register indicates Edmund's close ties with the cathedral. And similarly, Richard Swinfield's own appeal that I mentioned in 1285 seems to indicate that Edmund might still have been treasurer in February of 1285. There is one other post that Edmund seems to have kept beyond 1282, which on a 1st of June 1284, a letter of summons was issued by the Chancellor and Subdean of Salisbury, stating that Edmund still held a prebend there. A copy of the letter was to be issued to the vicar because he has no certain place or dwelling by reason of his prebend, while another was to be delivered personally to Edmund at Wigmore, and if the messenger couldn't find Edmund, it was then to be read aloud and presented in public. Why Edmund kept even one of these benefices post 1282 is really unclear, but it seems that maybe there was some indecision as to whether or not he wanted to be Lord or whether he wanted to continue in the church. The matter was finally decided by 1285 when Edmund actually married and his place as Lord of Wigmore was secured. Overall, his ecclesiastical career was a turbulent one which saw him embroiled in 2 long-standing disputes and excommunicated in both instances. Yet it seems to be where his judicious abilities were forged, and it's probably for this reason that the king commissioned him to undertake a number of inquiries and judgments in the March. Yet some modern studies of Edmund have seen him as untrustworthy, even. Charles Hopkinson and Martin Spate, specifically in their examination of the Mortimers, said that Edmund never built a career in royal service or achieved great office under the crown. Whether he was unambitious or untrustworthy is not clear, but King Edward seems to have doubted his ability to hold down an important office or to have mistrusted him. The king would have known all too well the difficulties that Edmund had been plagued with over the treasury and rectorship of Chipping Campden. And it may well be that instead of a political and military actor, the king saw Edmund's churchly qualities as far more befitting the role of a commissioner and a judge on important matters in the March. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ian. Yes, as I said at the start, then your work is, I think, bringing this Edmund much more into the forefront of our attention. And yes, I was pleased that you finished with that quote from Hopkinson and Spete, because it's always struck me as being a slightly lazy comment, and really just sort of being quite dismissive on the basis of very little work and analysis. And yes, the research that you're doing is very much bringing to life Edmund, and I know that you're sort of hoping to be able to now look at his secular career as well, as Lord of Wigmore. But I think one thing that's interesting, is that he does seem to have had a genuine vocation, doesn't he? Because yes, the sort of disputes and the multiplicity of offices are sort of strange to modern sensibility, but of course in the medieval time was just the way things were done, and his elder brother Ralph, as you say, died in 1274. So at any point from 1274 onwards, he could have said, yes, my future is as Lord of Wigmore, Lord of Maliennydd, etc., etc., and heir to one of the great baronies of the kingdom. And the fact that he prevaricated for so long does seem to indicate that he had a genuine vocation.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I mean, even scholarly opinion seems to be of that fact of Edmund was out of favour with the king. I think it was the great Linnaeus and J. Beverley Smith in both of their examinations, one of Llewellyn ap Griffith and one of the biography of Roger Mortimer of Chirk on the Oxford Dictionary National Biography, basically go on to state about the fact that because Roger Mortimer dies on the 27th of October, and it's not until late November, early December that Edmund does livery for the lands. And they say, oh, this delay at this point in time where the king specifically is in Wales and it takes a long time for Edmund to actually get hold of the lands, oh, this is proof of Edmund being disfavoured by the king. But it could well be that there are other things going on in the background. And similarly, a lot of people cite the letter that Edward I writes to Mortimer of Chirk, where he goes, we hope to recover in you some of the things that we have lost in the death of our friend, your father. And it seems to be almost that perhaps Roger Mortimer of Chirk should have been Lord of Wigmore instead. And like you said about Ralph dying in 1274, you then eventually get that great sort of round table tournament that Roger Mortimer hosts at Kenilworth, where specifically, the Wigmore Chronicle talks about the fact that Roger Mortimer, the son, and then the two other sons who are also knights, all get knighted specifically at that ceremony before they go across to Kenilworth. Edmund could have joined in then if his star was going to be aligned as Lord of Wigmore. So there's a part of it that I often wonder whether or not Edmund potentially positioned himself in late 1282, 1283 to try and succeed Thomas Cantilupe as Bishop of Hereford when Thomas died. And that maybe that Edmund was hedging his bets. And if he got the bishopric, he would have stayed in the church. But if he got the lordship, if he didn't, he was going to go for the lordship. That's kind of my running theory, but we'll see.
Well, no, very interesting. Yes, certainly worth speculating. Are there any other questions? A number of comments just in the chat about thanking you for the talk, Ian, and generally a wonderful afternoon, which is all good. But do you want to stop your screen share, Ian?
There we go.
And does anybody have any questions? Probably all too eager to go and watch the end of the rugby. England are actually hammering New Zealand, I think. I had a message put through to me. A question from Sean. Oh no, it's a question back to Faith. Faith, are you there, Faith?
Here, yes.
Question from Sean. He seems to recall a BBC programme on church history that suggested that one of the earliest images of Jesus, again on a Roman frieze, depicts Jesus as curly-haired and holding a wand. Is his recollection correct?
Yes, it's another sarcophagus, actually, and it's not far from the sarcophagus with the crown of thorns. It's on the opposite wall in the Vatican. It's not the only... Jesus is depicted with a wand several times in early Christian art, and with this sort of long curly hair. And there's two things going on here. First of all, Jesus is mimicking the imagery of gods like Apollo, who are also often depicted as very youthful, almost effeminate, and much younger. So he's imitating Apollo was also known as a good shepherd, right? So he's imitating that imagery early on. The other thing that's happening here is that it was very hard for the early Christians, especially when they're trying to get the word out, for Gentiles, for pagans to conceptualize the idea of miracles, right? Miracles needed to happen from the person to whatever was going on. And to do that, you needed a wand. So he's depicted with these sticks. For example, Jesus is touching some jars of wine, turning water into wine at the wedding in Cana, I believe. And so it's using the object is needed to go from the power of the magician into the object. So this is seeing Jesus, the magician, and he's seen with this several times for people to try to understand the idea of miracles, because this wasn't normal for the pagan world to see this kind of action in the way that it's depicted in the Gospels. But yes, they're very interesting. You can see them in the Vatican.
Is that where potentially contact relics and things like that then come in the Middle Ages, is from this idea that you would need, even Christ needed to touch something with this contact relic to turn water into wine or something like that? Is that where that kind of comes from, do you reckon?
Maybe that might have been a little distant for that exact connection, but it's that same idea, I think, of needing to be touched in order to make the miracle happen. But I think it's probably a slightly more ancient idea. The wands disappear pretty quickly once the theologians get their hands on it. So it doesn't last long. But the examples that we have are excellent.
Thank you. Okay, are there any other questions to Ian, or indeed to Faith and Louise?
There is from Caroline. Is there evidence of Edmund's monastic giving after taking up lordship, and does it reflect an attachment to the church? I've found very little so far, because I'm planning on trying to do the biography of Edmund as Lord of Wigmore and look into this sort of thing. That I've come across very little at the moment in terms of Edmund's patronage, but the Mortimers did patronize a number of churches, particularly locally, and there's a few, I think particularly Pembridge is one of them, which was rebuilt specifically by Edmund's mother, Maud, and things like that. So the Mortimers are still very much going to be tied into the church, whichever way it goes on. Interestingly enough, one of the things that I've noticed was that Roger Mortimer of Chirk appears twice in the Miracle Collection of Thomas Cantilupe, but Edmund doesn't. However, one of the men in Edmund's employ, looking after one of his horses at a field near Gloucestershire, does come up in the collection. So, I mean, there seems to be some form of perhaps continued attachment to the church, but I'm unsure at the moment whether it's anything outside of the usual regular kind of patronage that noblemen would give during this time.
Yes, and just picking up on what you said, Ian, it's Edmund's wife in particular who is associated with patronage and rebuilding of churches, isn't she? Yeah. Kingsland as well. I think it may be Kingsland you're thinking of rather than Pembridge.
Oh, okay.
Because Maud de Bries and her daughter-in-law were very much involved in rebuilding Kingsland Church. Pembridge was rebuilt later by the first Earl and Joan de Jonville. Although there may have been some patronage earlier on as well. But there's an interesting chapter in Nigel Saw's book on late 13th and early 14th century patronage of churches. There's a very helpful chapter on Mortimer patronage in that period. Yeah. Any other questions? No? In which case, then we'll just, if we can all thank Faith, Louise, and Ian for a fascinating afternoon, 3 brilliant talks, all bringing new aspects to our attention and really interesting insights. So many thanks to all 3 of you. and we look forward to welcoming everybody to our first event in 2026, a March miscellany of talks, 3 talks on different aspects of the March of Lordships at the end of January. So enjoy the rest of the new year, enjoy the rest of this year, and we look forward to seeing you in the new year. But thanks again to the speakers. Thank you.